This is episode 105 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. This week I am very pleased to be joined by Caren Cowen. She is the executive director of the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association, which of course works in Santa Fe and every day to help the cattle growing, ranching economy in our state. And welcome to the show, Caren.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about you and your organization. You've been at it for quite a while, doing this work in this area. How has New Mexico and the political climate for cattle growing changed over the 22 years you've been involved at the Cattle Growers?
We're still here, and I think that's the greatest thing that we can say. We have had tremendous amount of pressure over the last my 22nd anniversary will be in July. So over the last 22 years, we've faced a lot of pressure. We have lost some ranchers that simply couldn't continue living with wolves and things like that. But by and large, we have a ranching community that is thriving. One of the issues that we're concerned about is the average age of an agriculturalist in New Mexico is 65 years of age. And so part of our mission at this point in time is working hard to bring younger people to the ground.
Yeah, no doubt about it. That is very critical. And, I guess we'll start off with kind of that question, which is New Mexico maybe is more in this trend, but the entire country is in a trend of urbanization, big cities growing population-wise, while rural communities are struggling to keep people there. And I think New Mexico has that in spades to a greater extent. And now we have an administration, quite frankly, in office, and the legislature are very focused on cities like Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces. And they seem, if not lacking interest in rural New Mexico, overtly hostile to rural interests in New Mexico. Am I way off base there, or feel free to be as diplomatic as you choose and need to be?
Thank you. I probably wouldn't go so far as to say openly hostile, but there's a lot of lack of understanding that we need to find a way to bridge. I was taking a drive to Arizona a couple of weeks ago, which is where I grew up, and the national highway system, the interstate system has decimated lots of rural communities. The traffic that used to come through there and shop at stores, eat at restaurants, that sort of thing, it just zooms by at 80 miles an hour. And most of the country is missing the great part of what rural America has to offer. And so, it's a challenge to figure out how to do that. I mean, we all are in a hurry. We want to get from point A to point B in the fastest way possible. And as I said, speeding down the freeway at 80 miles an hour is the best way to get it done. But a lot of our rural communities are struggling. A Walmart will move in a community nearby, and your grocery store goes away. And then, you look at the post office, and every few years we get a threat that they're going to close rural post offices. And, as we look at economics and the way the post offices run at this point, I can understand them looking for cost savings. But when you take away those items that people have to go to town for, that they can see each other and meet, keep up with what's going on in the community, when you take that away, it just more and more isolates those that are living on the land and who are actually providing the stewardship for the land, taking care of the land and wildlife that are out there for all of society to enjoy.
Yeah, there's a lot of big points there already. Certainly we're not going to abandon the interstate highway system anytime.
No.
As much as I believe it was the original Cars movie where they had the kind of the Route 66 story written into that. I have kids, so I saw Cars and it's a worthwhile movie to check out. But there are a number of big public policy issues, and where I come up with the hostile thing is like the minimum wage increase. That may not be directly regarding rural communities and cattle growers per se, but $12 an hour and that mandate is going to have a much greater impact on mom and pop shops in rural New Mexico than it is in New Mexico's bigger cities.
Right.
And that's going to have a harmful impact in my estimation, while the left just says, oh, you're going to have the money tree out back is going to help pay for most of those workers. But there's other major issues that you're dealing with. Wolves are something that you can go down to the biopark and see them at the zoo. But other than that, folks in the Albuquerque metro, very significant majority of cities around New Mexico never are going to come in contact with wolves. But talk about the wolf and its impact on your industry, especially, I guess, Southwest New Mexico is where it is most predominant.
Yes, that's correct. And Eastern Arizona. When you look at it, a relatively few ranchers in the grand scheme of things are being impacted by wolves. But the impact that they're suffering is so disproportionate that, I can probably tell you 5 to 10 people that have sold their ranches and moved on from southwestern New Mexico. I had a call
because of the wolves, or
because
is it a big factor?
Because of the wolves. I mean,
Okay.
that's a huge factor. What we're seeing is that we're not getting adequate information from Fish and Wildlife about where the wolves are. I had a heart-wrenching conversation late yesterday afternoon with a friend who was impacted by the wolves, probably closer to first than anybody, but they now have a den up above their house. It's probably less than a half a mile from their home. And the stress of living under knowing that wolves are watching you and your family and your livestock 24/7 is about to cause an emotional crisis. And maybe about isn't the word. There is an emotional crisis, and we're not getting people to listen and understand.
Right. So let's take a quick step back. Of course, wolves were more or less extinct in the lower 48 states. I believe under the Clinton administration, they were released into Yellowstone National Park. That was fairly controversial at the time, of course, in the 90s. But in recent years, there have been wolves introduced by Fish and Wildlife around New Mexico, Arizona, et cetera. So you have some attempts to reintroduce this major predator, and there's contact with people who are living in Southwest New Mexico and other communities, often raising cattle, often losing cattle to those wolves. So, of course, the emotional impact, the challenge of raising kids, having pets, having animals that you're relying on for your income, very impacted by wolves. But kind of talk more broadly speaking about what's happening with the wolves and the interactions with people living in these areas in New Mexico.
This year, we're seeing some of the worst wolf kills that we've seen since 1998 when the first wolves were released into Arizona. I've got members calling that have had, 5 to 10 cows killed in the last 3 or 4 months, some of them even greater than that. And, to put a perspective on that, every time a cow is killed, that's like taking $1,500 to $2,000 out of your bank account. I mean, there's a cost to replace the animal. The animals become accustomed to the environment they're in, and to go buy an animal and replace that one. There's a perception that the government pays everybody for wolf losses. That could not be further from the truth. There are some government programs at this point in time that are offering some compensation, but the compensation is slow in coming. We're getting lots of complaints about the checks not coming in, and then they're only paying like 10 cents on the dollar. So, when somebody continues to take that out of your bank account, how long can you stand to continue in that job? Mm-hmm. And, let's be honest, there are folks that are hoping that the wolves drive ranchers from the land. When, wolves are doing what wolves do. But what people don't sometimes don't think about is the fact that, when wolves lived there 50 years ago or 60 years ago or whenever, there weren't the roads, there weren't the vacationers, there weren't the hunting populations that we have now. And the idea that there's just some giant forest out there where Bambi is being raised by a rabbit, that wolves will just live and play with everything else. Wolves are vicious animals. They eat cows that are alive. They'll eat calves that are trying to be born out of cows. And when they eat a calf, you don't find anything left. You don't find an ear. You don't find a hoof. You don't find anything.
Now, we've got a president who is more conservative than most and willing to anger people on the left in ways substantive and unsubstantive. He's taken on some issues with regulations and whatnot, but he hasn't, to my knowledge, said anything about wolves. I mean, a guy, real estate developer from New York City, he could not be more far removed from wolves. But I guess dual questions on the same general wavelength is, what is your organizational preference with regard to the wolf program of the federal government? And have you seen any reaction from the Trump administration, or are they not interested in moving in that direction, or are they moving in that direction? I'm just unaware of it.
They are moving in that direction. I think the president's fully aware of the plight of people in the West that have to deal with wolves. There is a rulemaking process going on at this point in time. Comments are due in July, but there is a move to delist wolves across the nation, all except the Mexican wolves. And Mexican wolves are a subspecies of the wolf, and I guess it makes no sense to me that you're going to delist a wolf, but not the subspecies that it spawns. So there are efforts going on in the Department of Interior, and folks with BLM and Forest Service see the same things that I see and hear every day. There are a lot of concerns out there, but we just haven't got the ball moving. But delisting the rest of the wolves, I think, is a huge step forward.
And what would delisting do? So they're not stopping the reintroduction of the wolves. This is a federal program that's happening, and there's management, et cetera. But delisting of an endangered species or previously endangered species, how would that benefit farmers, ranchers, et cetera, who are dealing with these wolves?
The management would get turned back over to the states. And so rather than working under the umbrella of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, states' game commissions and state game departments would be able to manage those wolves. And we firmly believe that until ranchers they can hunt wolves, are not going to be able to protect themselves. And having a managed hunting program with these animals, like we do for lots of other species, elk and deer and bears and cougars and everything else, those species are all flourishing. And when wolves are managed by state game departments as a wildlife species that they're working to keep in balance with other species, we hope that will be the only time we see change.
So you think that the state, given who is in control, Michelle Lujan Grisham and the legislature and the various people in office in New Mexico, deep blue kind of folks, that they would still do a better job than the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service? Or are you just hoping that Arizona, which is a little more red state, would be more inclined towards effective management and maybe embarrass New Mexico to do the right thing? What's your kind of...
We have a brand new game commission that, they had their first meeting last Friday. So, there will be a lot of things about wolf to be discussed as moves forward. But we believe and have believed that the government closest to home is the best government. And if we can at least work with a local game commission, it's not like having the federal government who at the end of the day say, we really feel sorry for you and we really want to help, but our hands are tied.
Right.
And one would hope, and the fear is that ranchers are going to be driven from the land. And this governor has talked about, her desire to keep agriculture on the ground. And it's our job to keep working with her and the legislature to try to educate. And sometimes people find that word offensive, but to know what's actually going on the ground. I don't mean that people aren't uneducated, but they don't know what we're living through.
All right. And kind of a similar in some ways issue, the border issue, the border crisis going on, that is impacting folks in your industry to a greater extent than other industries, certainly rural New Mexico. Again, talk about how some of your members are facing up to issues with regard to the border and where you see things going or hopefully going from your perspective.
There's a humanitarian crisis on both sides of the border. It's not just on the southern side of the border. And the crisis on the north side of the border is the rural families that live on the land and the rural communities that are trying to deal with this surge of new humans that are being driven to them. And what do you do with those people? It's not fair to just take them and house them someplace for a while and then ship them someplace else. I mean, we need a true solution about where these people are going. Are there jobs for them? Are we working on jobs training? Are we doing any of that kind of stuff? But living at the border is just about as big a strain, if not the same or more, as dealing with wolves. I mean, we have members whose children can't go do the chores without being armed, if they get to go do the chores at all. We have people that are riding pastures and they keep their kids inside. And they know there's people out there and they just try to look for their cows and not cause any ruckus any place because they're living under the fear of upsetting a drug cartel and being retaliated against. My dear friend Rob Krantz in 2010 was murdered by illegal who even went to the degree of shooting his dog. I mean, these people have no heart. They have no soul. And the family had reported, some drug activity not long before Rob was killed. So that's what you live with. Do you do the right thing? Do you do what you've always done? My 82-year-old mother with Alzheimer's lives about 40 miles north of the border. She has a bunch of chickens. When I was home last, half of the eggs were gone, and there were tracks into and out of the chicken coop. If people are hungry, more power to them. They could have all the eggs. But the idea that my mother is less than a football field away from people that are starving and hungry and could do anything for their own survival is pretty scary.
And you referred, of course, before to the cartels and them crossing the border alongside or embedded with some of the migrants that are just seeking a better life for themselves. And that was to your remark about them having no hearts and souls, et cetera, right?
Exactly.
Just wanted to make sure you're on that wavelength. So
absolutely.
So let's talk about another issue that you're dealing with that's kind of much different from the border security issue and wolves, much more nuts and bolts economic in line with the Rio Grande Foundation and our work, which is Holtec in southeast New Mexico, Carlsbad, Hobbs area, looking to put a nuclear storage facility. The community seems, at least by and large, to support it, although I don't know that I've seen any polling from that area. The governor, of course, Michelle Lujan Grisham, came out swinging and opposing the Holtec facility, and she cited New Mexico cattle growers alongside a group in out of Texas, the Permian Basin Petroleum Association. Your organization is one that she cited as opponents of that facility. So talk a little bit about where you're coming from on that issue.
Our members asked us to take this kind of a stand. Our policy is developed by members coming to conventions, passing resolutions. It goes to the board, it goes to general membership. But we had several members in the region that came to us and said, this is not a good thing for us. And, let's be honest, nobody knows what nuclear waste is going to do over time. The Holtec one was partially above ground, which is concerning. We fought a battle maybe as long as 3 or 4 years ago with underground storage in the Quay County area. New Mexico already has Carlsbad nuclear storage. So why do we need to be the dumping? WIP. I apologize. Thank you. Why do we need to be the dumping, the nuclear waste capital of the world? I mean, it's, these are our rural communities that are being hammered with this stuff. And I'd like to point out this is a place that we have some common ground with the governor, and I hope that we can build on it.
Now, are you worried that there's going to be an incident or some kind of that safety is the issue, or is it more of the perception of the area? What kind of specific concerns are driving your members' opposition to this? Because, we often, free market type folks like myself, are often confronted with people we call NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And I want to make sure that the opposition is based on something more than just, I don't want it here. Is that?
No, there are definitely concerns about safety. There's concerns about the transportation, taking it to these sites. The long-term effects. What's it going to do to water quality over time? There's just too many questions out there that can't be answered in terms of how we maintain our families and our businesses and our livestock.
And is it just people in that specific area? Like, obviously, you're an organization that covers folks all over the state, and ranching, cattle growing, et cetera, is all over the state. What kind of distance from that are we talking about, that proposed facility? Are we, miles away, or are people up and down the state kind of all questioning or concerned over this facility being potentially located there?
Obviously, the first ones to bring it up are the people that are closest to it, that are miles or tens of miles away. But we've learned as cattle growers that, when somebody has a problem, everybody goes to try and help. And so that's why we have the policy that we do. Members recognize that if it's not in their backyard today, something else is going to be in their backyard tomorrow. So the association prides itself on being able to work together to help people in individual instances and places for the good of all.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about, maybe we should have done this at the outset, but the economic impact of your industry in New Mexico. Specifically, I had a meeting recently with the land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, and I felt poked some gentle fun at her based on her logo that she had come up with her office, which had a bunch of windmills. I don't know if you remember this logo, but my point was that cattle are a much bigger economic driver on New Mexico's lands than renewables are currently. Of course, oil is the number one industry by a long shot, but talk about the economic impact of cattle growing and ranching in New Mexico. How big of a deal is it?
It is a big deal in New Mexico. Now, we're probably, I think the last time I looked, we were 28. We were ranked about 28th as cattle producing states in the nation. But for a state New Mexico size, that's not a bad number. The drought impacts, our weather conditions impact our cow numbers, and it fluctuates back and forth. But agriculture makes up about 12% of New Mexico's economy. And when you add that to the 30% of what the oil and gas industry provides the state in its economy, those two ground-based, dirt-based industries make up nearly half of the state's economy.
That's an interesting statistic. I was not aware of that. So speaking of those two industries, in the past, there's been angst, conflict between cattle raisers and oil and gas. Do you see that as an area that, generally speaking, the industries do get along pretty well, or are there kind of constant conflicts or growing conflicts, or what is the state of that kind of discussion with oil and gas and especially the booming southeastern part of the state and your industry?
We're working hard at a great relationship. I mean, there are things that we don't agree about, but we're all adults and we can try to figure out how to work through those things. When we got the Surface Owner Protection Act passed 10 or 12 years ago, that was a hard fought battle between the two groups. But through that, we learned to respect each other and learned how to better communicate. And that's something that we just continue to build on. We're all gonna live or die together. If we can't use the land to support our families, to feed and transport our nation and sometimes the world, we're doomed. So yes, we're going to, we may have some different disagreements, but we will work our way through them and have demonstrated over the last few years the ability to do that. The people in the southeast part of the state feel like the ranchers in the southeast part of the state feel like they're being hammered at this point, and they are, but that's because of the boom that's happening and the amount of exploration and production that's going on. Our country has a policy of energy first. I hope someday somebody will think about food first because it takes both of us to get along. And so that's something that the leadership of both of our organizations recognize at this point in time and that we're working on.
Now, is it the rush to develop the oil assets, or is it the roads and the infrastructure being kind of negatively impacted by the rush of oil and gas vehicles to get into southeast New Mexico? Or what kind of issues really are developing in that region between the two industries?
The roads and the transportation. We did a ranch tour about 2 years ago with one of our members in that area, and I thought I knew, how it could be. I was appalled. I mean, it's not safe to travel on some of those roads because there's just so much activity going on and everybody's in a hurry. Time is money. And there's kind of a lack of respect for the people on the ground that don't get as much that we need to work together and we'll stand together and fall together. Fences are cut. Pipelines are laid on top of the ground where you can't get in and out of your pastures. Not only is human safety involved with the roads and the speed at which people travel, but, your livestock is at risk as well. And dust on your pastures, there's some consequences of development, and we just need to work better together. And this is on it's not the industry versus industry. It's education and knowledge of the people who are actually working on the ground with the oil and gas companies, because, they have a mission, and, the faster and the better they do things, the more money they're going to make.
It's kind of like roommates or something, neighbors trying to get along in a new context. Something changed dramatically, which is that the oil boom happened because of new discoveries in the Permian Basin, and suddenly there's a lot of potential conflict, and some people deal with that sort of thing better. There's issues that come up that can be even more challenging, pour fuel on the fire of potential conflict or tamp things down. So I'm sure that's an interesting area of constant change within the state. And, hopefully, and again, I'm critical of a lot of what Michelle Lujan Grisham is doing as governor, but hopefully the money that is being pumped out of the ground and out of southeast New Mexico, some of that is returned to southeast New Mexico in the way of roads and infrastructure to help all residents of that particular area of our state, live and be there together, because that's industry is doing so much for the state. And I know that folks down in southeast New Mexico in the oil patch don't feel like they're getting a fair shake when it comes time to spend the money, and especially things like infrastructure and basic amenities like roads. They don't feel like they're getting what they're bringing in to the state and into the state's coffers.
And we don't disagree. And, absolutely, we've just got to work together every day. And, when there are bad actors, we need to identify them and correct the situation. But oil and gas is good for the state.
No doubt about it. So last question, getting it kind of more far afield, but something that as a free market guy, I haven't tried this particular product yet, but there is a push for a variety of reasons towards more plant-based, more vegetarian food, and your industry, cattle growers, that's directly in the bullseye, so to speak, with regard to meat alternatives. And I think I saw an announcement from Tyson Food saying that they are going to be embarking upon a big effort to bring more meat alternatives to market. Is this much ado about nothing? Is this a real threat? I've heard some people say that these are excellent products and they taste quite good and arguably are healthier, better for you from a cholesterol and fat perspective. But what's your take on the rise of meat alternatives?
It's definitely something of concern. I don't think that it's turning out to be, at least at this point in time, as bad as we had feared. I saw a headline the other day on an email that I got that said, "Impossible food, impossible to find in Albuquerque." But it's out there. But I think, the assumption that it's better for you is kind of premature. I was in the grocery store the other day and I came up with a package, and I'm not going to mention names, but there was a package of a meat-like product. And so I wanted to know what the content was. It's pea protein isolate, canola and sunflower oil, rice flour, spices, tomato powder, 5% or less yeast extract, sugar, potassium chloride, tapioca, a word I can't say, citric acid, salt, acacia gum, onion extract, natural flavor, which again, what does that mean? And garlic extract. And when you look at this, there are 3 grams in this particular serving. There are 3 grams of carbohydrates. Look at the nutritional values of beef. It's protein. There's no sugar. There's no carbohydrates. It's basically protein and water. And then you get into all your vitamins and minerals and that sort of thing. So, do you really want to be eating sugar when you think when you're looking for a meat substitute? How many carbohydrates do you want to take in, with that rice flour? And the fats, yes, meat has fat in it. But when you compare label to label, meat has less fat than some of these so-called meat substitutes. So I think, that it's a craze at this point when the 2 companies that are most prominent in these products, did their public rollout and they sold a lot of stock for a lot of money. But I heard last week that so far these companies have only been able to erode into 1% of the consuming public. And as your podcast with Crestline, people are not ashamed about eating meat. They know it's healthy. They know it's, that it's produced in a friendly manner by people who care about the animals and the land. And I think that perseveres over this list of chemicals that I just read.
I guess one last thing, we have a few minutes, talk about the impact or lack of impact of the trade battle going on right now. Would things, if they had gotten off the ground with Mexico in a bad direction, and in my opinion, in terms of tariffs, would that have hurt your industry? Is that impacting you? Talk about the economy and trade aspects of what's going on in cattle growing in New Mexico.
Had the Mexican tariffs actually been put in place, it would have been catastrophic. We have had the border shut down at times for whatever reason over the years. There are a lot of cattle that go between New Mexico and Mexico, Texas and Mexico.
That's pre-processed cattle?
Yes,
or,
on the hoof. On the hoof livestock that go both directions. And then there's a lot of meat that goes into Mexico from the United States. I'm not sure how much Mexico ships up here, but I don't think it's a large volume to speak of.
So Mexico's a big market for your cattle?
Yes, okay. And beef. China is a little bit different in that it appears, from what I'm able to learn about that it's more hurting the farming community. The soybean producers are the guys that are really suffering under that scenario. So yes, agriculture is taking a hit on some of this, but if we've got to get the trade imbalance straightened around, our economy is hugely important, and the president has seen fit to take a stand on this, and most people support him. I mean, most agriculturalists. But if I worked for the Soybean Association, I'd be probably telling you something radically different.
Got it. Well, anything else you want to share? How do people find out about the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association?
You can visit our website, which is nmagriculture.org. Just type in your Google NM, spell out agriculture all the way.org. We have a vibrant Facebook page. You can contact us through that. We're working on some Twitter at this point, and so there's an ability to contact us via Twitter. Our offices are located here in Albuquerque, and we're happy to talk to folks. We are a membership generated organization, so the income that we derive from our members makes up the vast majority of the income and the policy work that we do. There's a lot of folks in New Mexico who are ranchers who don't belong to the association, but the work that we do benefits everyone. But that's the story of trade organizations.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Caren Cowen, and we'll see you soon, if not before the legislative session kicks off in 2020. I'm sure we'll meet up again at some various organization like the Resource Bank, Heritage Foundation Conference, or another meeting together. So thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.